Hi, it's Carl Kopp, and I want to talk to you about the dark side of gamification. So, I want to start with a little disclaimer to let you know that I'm not disavowing gamification. I am not saying gamification is something that you should never do. I'm not saying, hey, I was wrong about gamification. Let's change everything. No. What I'm saying is that gamification, like any other tool in an instructional designer's toolkit, needs to be undertaken and used with care. We look at many different ways of implementing engagement strategies, and we need to know the strengths and weaknesses of any instructional approach that we decide to deploy. So, understanding some of the possible negative ramifications of gamification is going to help us tremendously as we start to think about how to create effective gamified instruction. Knowing what to avoid, knowing where possible areas of stress and de-stress are, knowing areas that will cause learners to lose focus, knowing all that is going to help strengthen the gamification solutions that we develop, design, and deliver to learners. So let's start by saying that lots of instructional tools can be used ineffectively, right? Not all instructional design tools are always effective. So one of the things that learners do often is cram. But we know cramming is a horrible way for long-term retention. It's great for short-term retention and taking the test the next day, but cramming is not good for overall long-term success of retrieval of the information. We know that lectures are not that good for higher level, higher order thinking. We know some learners don't like discussions. Some learners do well in group work and some do not. We've all been in groups where we've had people not carrying their weight. And gamification is right there with all these tools. So again, it's not that gamification is inherently bad, but just like cramming has a dark side and lectures have a dark side and group work and discussions have a dark side, so does gamification. So let's examine the dark side of gamification and see how we can mitigate some of the possible risks of this thing called gamification. Now, interesting, when gamification first came out, there was a lot of backlash against gamification, and some of it deserved and some of it not. So one person said, hey, you know, gamification is BS, right? And it's BS is basically an effort to conceal, to impress, or coerce. The saying about the rhetorical power of the word gamification. So this word has so much power and it does what these liars or charlatans want to do, right? They want you to think that games are magical. We'll take all the cool magical stuff of games, we'll inject it somehow into instruction, and boom, you'll have magically fun, engaging instruction. And there's a group of people that said, no, that's not really true, right? Game developers and game players have critiqued gamification, that it gets games wrong. It mistakes incidental properties like points and levels and badges for primary features like interactions with behavioral complexity. And that's true. The surface level items of gamification, points, badges, and leaderboards, when not implemented correctly, oftentimes cause more harm than they do good. What really, nobody plays a game just to play a game, right? They play for the challenge, they play for the camaraderie, the competition. So there is some truth to the fact that if you just rely on superficial elements of games, you're not going to drive motivation. And in fact, you might have an opposite effect, an effect that you don't want to happen at all. So we need to be careful about gamification and its possible implications. And so this has led to a lot of talks about the evils of gamification. People call gamification shamification, right? Shaming people into action, or exploitationware, right? We're exploiting the natural human tendency to, see progress or to collect things or to want to earn points, and thus the name pointification, right? Believing these people believe that gamification is nothing more than manipulation, exploitation. And in some cases, unfortunately, gamification is used to exploit or to try to manipulate people. And this is not the way gamification should be implemented. This is something that we as designers of gamified experiences need to avoid. We need to make sure that when we implement gamification, we're implementing it in a way that optimizes the best elements of gamification and minimizes any potential dark sides of gamification. People call gamification chocolate covered broccoli. They don't like broccoli, and to get you to eat broccoli, we cover it with chocolate. And that's bad because just making chocolate covered broccoli is not a good thing. But this goes back way more than that. Think about Mary Poppins, right? A spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. So there is something to be said for adding some elements of fun or engagement to otherwise not fun, not engaging. But if you overdo it, if you are trying to exploit people, or you're trying to leverage an innocent behavior for your outcomes, that's when gamification becomes really, really inappropriate. And in fact, there's some research that shows that it's not really that effective if used wrong. And again, you could lecture wrong, you could do discussions wrong. So it's not just gamification, but gamification can actually lead, if you're not careful, to demotivation. People actually are unmotivated when they see the game elements or gamification that you've created. There can also be fatigue. People get bored or tired of gamification. It can increase somebody's stress level. So they're not relaxed or comfortable. They're actually more stressed, more worried because now they have to get on the leaderboard, or now they have to earn all these points, and it just increases their everyday stress in terms of learning. Sometimes it focuses on the wrong outcomes. People start to focus on winning rather than what they should be learning with gamification. This isn't good. Sometimes people feel manipulated. Some people think that gamification, they open it up the screen and go, or their boss tells them, oh, we're going to do gamification. Like, oh my goodness, this is so silly. It's such a waste of my time. Just give me a PDF of the content. I don't need this silly gamification. That's for kids, right? And that's when gamification is off the rails, because people forget that gamification is not necessarily making things look like a game or feel like a game, but using elements in games that are successful. So a progress bar is a form of gamification, but it doesn't have to look like a game. Collecting things, a form of gamification, but it doesn't have to look like a game. So one of the mistakes that causes a lot of this is people want to make their order entry system look like a game. And for some people, that's great. For some people, that's not great. So these are some potential problems: demotivation, fatigue with gamification, increased stress, focusing on wrong outcomes, feeling like you're being manipulated, and then the silliness that happens. So I want you to take a moment and play this game, progresswars.com. So I'll wait as you just type it into your URL and play for about 5 minutes. It's a really good example, and it's made to be kind of an example of really bad gamification, really bad elements that are in there. I mean, it's got all the right elements. It's got progress bar, it's got levels, it's got, missions, all that kind of stuff, but it's done completely irresponsibly. And so go ahead and play that, and you can pause the video if you want, and we'll come back and discuss gamification after you play Progress Wars. See how far you get in 5 minutes. Okay, so hopefully you had your experience playing Progress Wars. I won't say hopefully you had fun, because it's not necessarily fun. But let's look at some of the research. So there's an article called The Dark Side of Gamification, an overview of negative effects of gamification in education. So these researchers took a look at a number of different studies talking about gamification in educational settings and found that there are some negative outcomes or negative effects that can be encountered. So one is indifference, one is loss of performance, one is undesired behavior, and then the fourth is declining effects. Now, again, there's lots of research on the positive aspects of gamification, but now researchers are starting to look at the negative aspects. So let's dig into these a little bit deeper. So the first one is indifference. And what is that? Well, it occurs when gamification is reported to not have any influence at all, right? Either for better or worse. So the learners in the study, right? It didn't influence the learners in the study at all. Participants in those studies indicated that the experience was not, not enjoyable. It's not boring. It is what it is. Just got to do it. And just take the instruction. So it doesn't really bode well for those that are going, oh, gamification will make everything fun and everybody will love it. And that, first of all, that's not the case. Uh, not everybody loves games. Not everybody loves gamification. Not everybody learns the same way or prefers to learn the same way, right? So students were just not interested in gamification and they wanted traditional methods over gamified ones. And so this is not an uncommon occurrence. And the research shows that leaderboards and badges most led to the feeling of indifference. So be careful how you decide to use leaderboards and badges. And in fact, you're always or often going to have a situation where somebody's bored. Like, who cares about the game? Who cares about gamification? I just want to learn the stuff and move on. I don't care. It's not that they don't like it. It's just that, I could do without it. I could take it or leave it, whatever. So indifference is a definite issue that may occur with gamification. And so you need to be careful that you don't provide gamification to people who really couldn't care one way or the other if you gamified it or not. Now the second is, I think, a little bit more troublesome. Indifference, so what? But loss of performance. So that's where tasks and situation where gamification actually hinders or hurts student progress. So where did that happen? Well, learners didn't like being penalized in the gamified activity. They didn't want to lose points for answering a question incorrectly. So they got very upset with that. Or they were more focused on the gamified mechanics than the actual learning itself. So they were very, very worried about moving from, one level in the leaderboard to the next level, or collecting badges or earning points to the point where they forgot about what they were supposed to be learning. And this is something that's really important to keep in mind. And it happens in gamification a lot if you make the stakes of gamification too high. Like, hey, if you get the top of the leaderboard, you're guaranteed an A. Well, that actually raises the stakes to where people are more focused on getting to the top of the leaderboard than learning the information that they should be learning. So that's not a good way to approach it. You actually want the stakes to be rather low so that people don't get so caught up in just going after the prize. And where this comes into play is all three, right? What they call the evil trifecta of gamification. Points, badges, and leaderboards often lead to loss of performance if they're not tied into intrinsic motivation, and if the learners feel like they're being penalized, and if the game mechanics and elements are the focus of the gamified experience and not the learning. So we need to make sure that if we're going to use points, badges, and leaderboards, we use them sparingly and they take a little bit of a back seat to the instruction that we're trying to provide to the learners. Now, another area is badges, and I always kind of like this.
We are federales, the mountain police.
If you're the police, where are your badges?
Badges. We ain't got no badges. We don't need no badges. I don't have to show you any stinking badges.
So I think that's kind of funny, right? But there's some truth to the fact that, hey, I don't need a stinking badge, right? I'm trying to learn this. I'm trying to do my job, and the badging and all that points might get in the way. So if the focus is not on learning, badges actually have a very negative effect, as do points, as do leaderboards. So another undesirable effect, so we have indifference, we have lack of performance, we have undesired behavior. And this is kind of related, but this is where it has both a positive and negative effect on the context in which the learning's happening, right? Which means that the mechanics actually cause demotivation. And maybe that's because of excessive competition. I just want to win. So whatever I have to do to win, if I have to cheat, if I have to manipulate the system, I'm just focused on winning. I'm just going to try to win. That's my number one thing. Well, again, in a gamified learning environment, really what we want to do is motivate people to learn. Winning is secondary, at least, to the learning process. And it turns out, again, learners are more focused on the gamification mechanics, so they start to do behaviors that focus on winning points, but not on learning or the desired outcome. So let me give you an example. I went to a conference a number of years ago, and they had a gamified app. And the idea behind that particular gamification effort was to get people to socialize with one another and get to know people that you didn't know from across the country and in some cases across the world. So one of the elements in the app is they wanted you to get a picture with somebody else, post that picture, and you'll get points. So, the first day people were diligently getting pictures, selfies with friends and people that they just met and that kind of stuff. But then people started figuring out that the picture, nobody was checking the picture. So you could have a picture of your foot, you could have a picture of a door, you could have a picture of your hotel room, and guess what? You got the same number of points. And it was a lot easier to take 5 pictures of your hotel room than it was to try to get 5 different people for these selfies. So the undesired, oh my goodness, the behavior that was not desired was people taking pictures of nothing because they got points for it. So that's a negative effect and an undesired behavior because people were taking pictures of like nothing that we wanted. So when you think about creating a gamified experience, you want to think about, is the incentives where you earn points and level up and get badges, is that experience enhancing the outcome that you want or taking away from the outcome that you want? And if it's taking away, you need to seriously consider, do you need to change rules? Do you need to eliminate that game mechanic? What is happening where people are not necessarily exhibiting the behavior that you want? So you need to think about that. And here's an example of where leaderboards and badges drove the undesired behavior, right? You want to be on that leaderboard because you want to have the most pictures, and all of a sudden you're taking pictures of your foot like 5 times in a row. Not good. Or you're getting badges that aren't really meaningful. So those are issues that you need to think about. And I always say about the leaderboard, like the first person on the leaderboard, they're highly motivated. The 11th person, kind of motivated, not much. The 100th person, not motivated at all. So you have the undesirable effect of, hey, I'm 100th on the leaderboard. I'm never going to catch up. I quit. I'm not going to go through all this. I'm done. Right? So that's an undesirable behavior because you don't want somebody to quit. We want people to keep being engaged in the gamified environment. So that's why a couple of mitigations for this is, one is group-based leaderboards, because being in a group means you don't want to let the group down, so you're going to try harder. So that's one element of helping that. The other is to reset leaderboards on a regular basis. So people might say, hey, I'm at the leaderboard and I'm so far behind I will never catch up, I quit. But resetting the leaderboard every week, for example, or every month, depending on how you've designed it, gives people hope. And so, hey, I didn't get it last week, but this week I have a chance. I have a shot at it. So you can do things like resetting leaderboards. You can do things like group leaderboards, but you have to be very careful that you might get the undesirable behavior as people try to go up the leaderboard and not really focus on what they're actually learning. Now, another is declining effects, which basically mean that you gradually lose motivation and engagement because of gamification. So you might have initially been engaged, but gamification comes along, you're like, yeah, whatever. I'm not really that excited anymore. I'm not really that interested. The learner's motivation and engagement decrease over time, and that can lead to the loss of performance. So again, I say about a lot of things, right? There are 4 categories where you could lose interest in gamification, and they're not mutually exclusive, right? So you could have declining effects of gamification. People are no longer as motivated, and that could lead to loss of performance. And it could also lead to undesirable effects, like I'm so bored with this gamification, doing it the right way. How can I manipulate the system that I might then be successful? And because humans are really good at working systems, we're really good at trying to get out of work by being clever. And so if you put a gamified system in front of somebody and they have some time to think about it and they're kind of bored with it, or they want a quick win, they're going to very easily and very quickly start to gamify the gamified system. And you might not get the impact that you want. You might actually get different impacts. Sometimes it can be valuable, but sometimes not. An example of this is there was a hacking contest. So they wanted to see who was the best hacker, right? Arguably a game type environment. And the way that you became scored points is you had to hack into different servers. I don't know, there were 10 different servers. And each one progressively more difficult than the last one. And so as you hacked a server, your score was up on the giant leaderboard, and everybody could see how you were doing. And then when you hacked into another server and got into that security, you would rise up on the leaderboard. Well, the person that actually won the contest, the person at the top of the leaderboard had a score that was so much higher than anybody else's score. It was an incredible score. So at the end of the contest, they're like, okay, look, how did you get such a high score? And they started looking and saw the person had not hacked into all these computers in succession. In fact, they only hacked into one of the computers, yet they were still on the top of the leaderboard. They're like, well, how'd you do that? Like, we know something's up. Well, the person doing it, instead of hacking through all these servers to score on the leaderboard, hacked into the leaderboard server and gave themselves an incredibly high score, right? So they actually went right. Now, you could argue that was a pretty clever solution, but nevertheless, it wasn't the effect that they wanted. They wanted to see, could these people hack their way through these progressively more difficult servers? Did they know how to overcome the security, all that kind of stuff? And that person just bypassed all that and just went boom right for the number one place, which was putting themselves on a leaderboard. So again, they weren't paying attention, and we couldn't test. You were not able to test whether or not this person had those skills because they went right to the other thing, and you get declining impact of the gamification itself over time. And again, points and leaderboards are the elements that lead to this declining performance. So points and leaderboards tend to lead to fatigue, basically fatigue over time. Like, yeah, I don't care anymore if I'm on a leaderboard. I've been trying for 3 weeks to get to the top of the leaderboard. I can't. I just give up, right? We also run into the issue of like being really bored with it, as I said before. So if we look at the table, the negative effects and their gamified designs, we can see that the negative effect of indifference occurred in 8 of the studies, and the most impacting elements, the elements that most contributed to indifference, were leaderboard and badge. If you look at loss of performance, the things that contribute to that were leaderboard, badge, and points. undesirable behavior, badge and leaderboard, and declining effects, points, leaderboards, were the declining effects. But take a look at this for a second. Look at indifference. If we look at indifference and we take a look at the items, I think we notice something very interesting. Look at instant feedback. Didn't have any negative impact on indifference. Challenge didn't have any impact, nor did social status here. And look at this. Under loss of performance, you have social interaction, didn't seem to have a negative impact. Feedback, challenge. So there are elements, I like to call it that deeper gamification, right? Deeper than points, badges, and leaderboards, where we could see that this deeper gamification doesn't have that negative impact. So if you're gamifying a learning environment and you're relying on points, badges, and leaderboards, that's not really a good way to do that, because what it does is it actually can demotivate the learner. So instead, focus on things like challenge and social status and interaction, feedback, the narrative, those kinds of things. And that will help steer you away from a totally inadequately executed gamified environment, right? It will lead to indifference. It will lead to loss of performance. It will lead to undesirable behavior and declining effects if you only focus on leaderboards, badges, and points. That's not enough. You can't rely on that alone for your gamified strategy. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, but like all research, we want a body of knowledge, right? We don't just want to look at one study and then draw a conclusion from one study. So there are several studies on the dark side of gamification. Here's one on the dark side of gamification related to health management. And basically, one place where lots of apps are gamified is the health field, right? They want to try to gamify taking better care of yourself. And it's an admirable goal. But there's a dark side to that as well. It turns out that competition and interactivity of gamification are positively associated, which means that they can cause feelings of privacy invasion and social overload, which can lead to gamification exhaustion. Right? So basically what this means is that yes, a healthcare app is kind of good in some ways, but in some ways it leads to people feeling that their privacy has been invaded or that they're too committed to social interaction. So let's take a look, right? The other danger, so we have the danger, of course, of privacy invasion, social overload, is if you're really trying to help somebody become better and they get fatigued with your gamified app, and that's what they were using for their health, then you might be putting their health in danger because they've stopped using the gamified design. So people feel like other people knowing about, my health status or how many miles I ran today or what food I ate today, they don't like that. That's privacy invasion. And then people don't like the fact that I'm sharing that with everybody. Like, do I have to comment on Carl's weight loss? Do I have to comment on what he ate today? Oh my goodness, he eats like 10 times a day. I'm social. I'm exhausted trying to comment. I'm just going to quit the app, but now I can't lose weight myself because I've quit the app, right? So you run into issues like that when you are not properly implementing gamification, and it leads to feelings of stress, like, oh, I know I should be using the app to lose weight, but I use it and I get overloaded, and they take all my privacy information. There's a commercial now, I think, on TV about where they start talking about somebody's privacy information, And so related to healthcare. So this could be a potential downside of gamification. And this feeling of, as we've said before, this oversharing, right? The circulation of information and data can lead to me feeling like, things that I think should be private don't seem to be private, and I'm not comfortable with that. And now I'm all stressed out. So those are other potential negative aspects of gamification, this time from the perspective of a health app. Now, there's more research on negative aspects. Here's another article called Uncovering the Dark Side of Gamification at Work, Impacts on Engagement and Well-Being. So this particular study looked at frontline employees in a retail environment and said, hey, what is gamification doing to some of these employees? And they found, interestingly, that some of the employees felt that they had increased stress, just like the health app, right? They felt that, okay, I've got a ton of things to do on my job that I have to keep track of, that I have to learn, that I have to do, and now I got to figure out and deal with all this gamified interactions. That seems like too much for me, right? So that causes a lot of stress. And when people get stressed, sometimes they tend to disengage with whatever's causing the stress, which makes sense, right? I mean, if you're feeling a lot of stress, you might disengage with the areas that are causing a lot of stress. And what happens, though, is that resulted in a reduction in employees' well-being. They felt more miserable at work. They weren't as happy as work. They weren't as interested or engaged. And therefore, and also, they then had a decrease in performance. We saw that before in the education study, right? A decrease in performance due to gamification. Here we have the same thing, gamification at work. So we can start to see some trends, right? We see the trend of stress, gamification causing stress. We see a trend of decreased performance. We see a trend of people becoming disengaged with the process as it's occurring. This particular research paper looked at they did 3 different studies, and they found that one of the things that mitigated some of these feelings was voluntarily participating in it. So by definition, and this has been a knock on gamification, hey, if games are like this voluntarily fun thing that we do, as soon as we make it not voluntary, is it still even a game? Right? Is it now something that we're obligated to do? And I don't want to do something I'm obligated to do, even if it's quote unquote fun, right? So gamification really, to be most effective, requires people really to think about getting people to volunteer to take part in it. So in that way, it's on the designers of it then to make it engaging and interesting so that people want to take part in it. And also then that says a little bit of how we market it, right? And how we implement it. We want people to want to participate in the gamified experience. So we want to market as something that's good for them, something that's optional. Remember, we go back to the self-determination theory. We know autonomy, or the ability to make your own decisions, is a key element of motivation. So we want to make sure that we give people choices about whether or not or how they participate. Maybe you can't 100% give them a yes or no, but maybe you can give them degrees. Do you want full-on gamification? Do you want just a couple gamified elements? Do you want to be reminded daily of the gamification, or maybe monthly? You can do things to make the gamified experience recede a little bit into the background. So, but this is interesting research. They found that the potential problems were lower individual and team engagement, so that people in these kind of forced gamified environments were not as engaged, which we talked about before, increasing stress of the frontline employees. And the frontline employees felt that the gamified approach in these studies felt like manipulation, right? A carrot and stick. Hey, here's a carrot, go after this, go after this. Oh, not going to do that. Okay, boom, we're going to whack you for it, right? We're going to take away points. We're going to externally regulate your choices. And that decreases intrinsic motivation of the employees. So you want to really be careful. We want to really be careful as designers of gamified instruction, how much we're going to use the carrot and stick. Maybe we don't deduct points for wrong answers. Maybe we focus not on points, badges, and leaderboards, but we focus on challenge, focus on narrative, focus on what I often call content gamification as opposed to structural gamification. So structural gamification is not changing the content, but adding game elements around the content like points, badges, and leaderboards. That's content gamification. That's that's structural gamification. Maybe more content gamification, which is making, adding challenge, adding narrative, adding virtuous cycles. Those kind of things can lead to more positive gamification than, again, just relying on the superficial items that, is called out BS. These superficial items, people are pretty smart. They're not going to fall for it. So don't just sprinkle those in and think it's going to be great. You really need to think about more substantive gamified experiences. And as I said before, in some of these talks and lessons, is that if we look at intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, poorly designed gamification with just relying solely on points, badges, and leaderboards, no reinforcement of motives, no sense of purpose, no narrative, no contextualization, means that people are focused on the wrong things, and they're focused on externally motivating elements like points or badges and leaderboards, and a focus solely on external elements to drive behavior is not a sustainable model. It doesn't work. What you really want is to have a combination of intrinsic, I want to do this for my own well-being, and extrinsic. When you do that, the extrinsic elements kind of fade into the background a little bit, and the intrinsic elements are what are focused on and what grow. So bad gamification, the dark side of gamification, definitely tends toward points, badges, leaderboards, and towards manipulation, which we don't want. And I'll give you a great example of how extrinsic and intrinsic works. My son, when he was younger, we wanted him to get a brush to brush his teeth, right? So I don't know how old he was, maybe 5 years old. And I said, "Hey, Nate, if you go brush your teeth, I'll give you a star." And man, I never saw that kid move so fast. And man, he was upstairs brushing his teeth. It was awesome to behold. So I turned to my wife and I'm like, "Hey, raising kids is actually pretty easy. I don't know why people think it's so hard. We'll give Nate, stars, and when he's 16, he wants to drive, he has to earn so many stars. It'll be perfect." Well, about 3 days later, maybe a week later, maybe 2 weeks later, I said, "Hey, Nate, time to brush your teeth. Go upstairs and get a star." He's like, "I don't want a star." I'm like, "What do you want?" He goes, "I want 2 stars." Because the problem with external motivation is that if that's the only thing motivating a person, it has to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Otherwise, it's no longer motivational. It's just human nature. Once we achieve something, we want to achieve the next thing. So once I get a star every day for brushing my teeth, so what? I did it, been there, seen it, done it. I want 2 stars to brush my teeth. I want 3 stars to brush my teeth. At the end, we were giving Nathan a candy bar to brush his teeth. So, it kind of totally defeated the whole idea of the star chart, right? And it's not as easy being a parent as just giving out star charts. But this also works for other things as well in terms of this negative effect, right? If you say, oh, every time you log in, you get 5 points. Well, after a while, they don't care about 5 points. It's not gonna motivate me anymore, right? Because it's all external motivation. Oh, we're gonna give you more points if you log in 5 days in a row, 10 days in a row, 15 days in a row, 20 days in a row. At a certain point, you're like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care if I miss one or not. It doesn't really matter. It loses its power to drive behavior. So that's why gamification and gamified learning solutions you can't set and forget. You've got to add variety, add different items, add elements into gamification, or else it's just not going to be as effective. Now, we haven't even talked about the ethical implications of gamification. If you can create a gamified experience where you're actually manipulating people, which unfortunately there's some nefarious actors out there, then you have a whole set of ethical gamification issues. So one is, are you giving the participant any kind of choice at all? And if you give them fake choices, they may catch on to that. So you want to give them legitimate choices. And what are those choices? Do they have a choice to opt out of gamification? Do they have a choice to do more or less gamification? Do they have a choice to learn the content some other way? You don't want to be force feeding somebody gamification. You want to provide them with options that they could select from in terms of learning the content that you want. Another look is, what's the intention of the design? Are you trying, there's a lot of talk nowadays about social media apps that are trying to addict people to the app. And in fact, I saw a really interesting documentary the other day that found out that negative information in social media drives more engagement than happy, more engagement than neutral, more engagement than sad. But things that trigger people, that make them upset, means they'll interact. Like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that person said that. I have to respond, right? And now you're engaged. It's a negative engagement, but you're still engaged. So the idea is, what's the intention of you as the designer? Are you trying to manipulate the learner, or are you trying to give them some sense of motivation to get through and make their life a little bit better? So we can't always know the intention of the designer of gamification. But if we are designing the gamification ourselves, we really need to have a positive intention. We really want the learner to learn this because it's good for the learner, or it's good for the organization, or has some element of good. If you're just doing it to manipulate people and to get them to do what you want, that's one, completely unethical. So stop doing that. And two, it will break down over time. People will eventually see through your manipulations. And when they do, in the case of learning, they won't want to learn anything. They won't want to participate. They become disengaged. I mean, look at the the stress. They might get stressed by your gamified solution. Their performance might drop because of your gamified solution if you're trying to manipulate them. Their engagement might drop. I mean, all kinds of negative effects for bad intentions. So want to try to think of the positive outcome for the learner, focus on that. You might also want to think about the positive and negative outcomes of being in the gamified system. Is this good for people? Is it not good for people? What are the implications? Are they going to lose time in this system? Is it preventing them from doing their quote unquote real job, right? I mean, you don't want your gamification system to take away from the behaviors and the outcomes that the organization wants. That's not good. So you need to think about that. You need to make sure that whatever you do create, that the benefits outweigh the negatives. Right? The beneficial outcomes are weighted toward the desire of the learner, not the designer. Right? The designer's desire might be, hey, let's keep this person in this app as long as we can. Well, from a learning perspective, from an organization perspective, that might not be the best thing to do, right? So you need to think about, am I really benefiting the user, the learner? That's what you need to focus on. Can learners volunteer? We talked about this before. Can I get the information some other way? And is the culture in the organization already healthy, or are you introducing gamification into an unhealthy, unproductive culture? Now, this is a bigger question, right? As designers of instruction, we don't always know about the culture of the whole organization. Sometimes we have some insight. And just like almost any intervention, you are not, just because you created quote unquote gamified learning, you're not going to change the culture of that organization. So if it's already cynical, if people already feel stressed, if they feel like management is micromanaging them and watching everything that they do, gamification will only make that worse. There's no way it'll make it better. It will only make it worse. So look at the culture and make a decision about the culture as you're thinking about gamification. It's not Gamification is not a panacea. It's not a cure-all. It's a instructional strategy, the way that we're looking at it, pure and simple. And you're not changing an organization simply by gamifying. There's a lot of work to do if you're going to change corporate culture. And what they say is, corporate culture eats strategy for breakfast. Corporate culture is tough to change, and it takes more than just a gamified app to do that. So if learning is not valued in the organization, gamifying learning's not going to help that much. So you need to be aware of that. In that case, I would say if learning's not valued, I'm not sure I would spend my time gamifying learning or trying to talk management into gamification. It's just going to be unproductive for all. And then also, you need to think about, like, should you as a designer take responsibility for the actions of the players? This doesn't happen much in learning experiences, but think of like Pokemon Go, where some learners or some players put themselves in harm's way to try to collect the Pokemon. That's not good. And the designers sometimes say, well, that's not my fault. I didn't know that they were going to do that. But are you completely fault-free? So if you're like, hey, I didn't know the learners were going to cheat the system, and that's how they were going to get on the leaderboard, right? Well, you need to think about it. So if you create a gamified learning system, you need to think about, how are the learners going to cheat? And if they cheated, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Typically, it's a bad thing. Is it going to be a horribly bad thing and we need to change the system? Or can we put a rule into place to prevent the bad thing? Or it's not quite as catastrophic as we think, so we're okay. So I like to give this example that I read in a book about this person who made a rule. He was the president, CEO of a company. He made this rule. He said, okay, everybody in this company has to come up with 2 new ideas for improving something in the company every single week. It's career limiting if you don't come up with 2 ideas every week. So a little bit later on, he hires a consultant company. Consultant company comes in and goes, I want you to help us. We have this idea of two new ideas a week, but we still want, as many good ideas as possible. We want to get an outside perspective. So consultants come in, talk to people, make some recommendations. So the consultants started talking to people, and they found out pretty quickly that there was this whole underground exchange system of ideas. So if one week I did not have a good idea, I can't think of 2 ideas, rather than career limiting, I could go to this network and say, hey, I need some ideas. And you would get some ideas. Sometimes you had to promise future ideas, but there's this whole exchange of ideas going on so that everybody could turn in 2 ideas at the end of every week. And the consultants are like, oh my goodness, how much cheating, look at all the cheating that's going on. These people are not coming up with their own ideas. They're borrowing other people's ideas. They're bartering ideas. They're trading ideas. This truly is cheating. So as good consultants do, they went back to the person sponsoring them and said, hey, we got some news. We got some startling news for you. We got to tell you about this amazing network of cheating where they're changing ideas and everything like that. And every week, people who don't have ideas grab ideas from other people. This is horrible. You should put a stop to it right away, they said to the CEO. CEO goes, what do you mean it's horrible? They go, but these people, they're stealing ideas and they're not coming up with their own ideas and they're exchanging ideas and it's not. And the CEO said, no, that's the impact that I want. And they're like, what? I don't get it. Why do you want people like cheating the system? He goes, because now every week, people all over the company are talking to each other about ideas to improve the company. So that's an awesome outcome. And consultants were like, oh, yeah, actually, that is an awesome outcome. So the cheating was kind of designed into the system. The CEO had an inkling that people would not have 2 new ideas every single week and that they would have to talk to other people and they would be talking to them about ideas to improve the company. So when we say that designers should take responsibility for the actions of the players all the time, maybe there's some truth to that, but we also need to think about consequences of possible cheating. And some of those consequences, as I just described, could be very positive. So that's something to think about as we think about ethics and gamification. So let's conclude this. Let's tie up our loose ends for this lesson, right? So one, gamification definitely has a downside, definitely has a dark side, and there are things that we as designers need to be careful of. I would say a big thing to take away is that you have to adopt gamification carefully so that you can improve job satisfaction, job engagement, job performance, learning outcomes. You cannot haphazardly simply assign points, badges, and leaderboards to content and believe naively that you're not going to cause any harm. You will cause harm if you don't implement gamification correctly. So you've got to be careful. This also speaks to the idea of focusing on more important things, deeper things like narration, social interaction, overcoming challenges. Those are things that drive more meaningful gamified experiences. The other thing that we know from this research that I mentioned, but now I'm calling it out specifically, is that explicit consent of the players increases their receptivity to gamification. So asking people to voluntarily participate is better than mandating participation in a gamified learning solution. I'm a big believer in giving learners choices. So, hey, here's 3 ways you can learn. You can learn through a gamified experience. You can learn from straight content. You can learn through instructor-mediated one-on-one coaching. Whatever it happens to be, give people choices. Now, also, when we talk about having learners participate voluntarily, I've seen some other research that says that people who are consulted or spoken with before a gamified effort are more willing to partake in the gamified effort. So basically what it means is, hey, before you gamify, get together some people and say, hey, what would you like to see in a gamified version of this instruction? What kind of things motivate you, your colleagues, etc.? If you can get this focus group going and get people to contribute to it, when you implement those ideas, people will be much more likely to adopt the gamified approach than if you just said, hey, we spent 6 weeks in isolation and we came up with this isolated gamification plan, which we think everybody will love. That won't be the case. That won't happen. So that's the conclusion. Make sure you implement gamification carefully. You avoid relying solely on points, badges, and leaderboards. And you keep in mind that with gamification, there are potential issues like disengagement, stressing people out, exhaustion with the gamified solution, even a potential lack of performance or disengagement with team members. So again, gamification is not the panacea. It's like any instructional solution. There are good and bad items of gamification. You just need to implement it carefully and with thought, and you will have a great gamified experience. Okay, so that's the lesson on the dark side of gamification.